The sun sat heavy over the town, flattening every shadow into the dust. Elias Boone came slow down the main street, reins loose in his hand, his body bent with the long years that had carved themselves into his shoulders. Folks glanced at him as he passed, some nodding with half-hearted courtesy, others muttering that the old rancher was wasting his time where men bartered cattle and seed. He said nothing. His face was a stone, unreadable, eyes narrowed against the glare. By the pens, the usual noise filled the air, shouts, the bawl of steers, boots pounding boards. But it was not cattle that caught him, not stock that bent his hand to his wallet. At the far end stood two women, thin as fence posts, their lives spoken for by men who treated them like tired horses. A debt collector read the terms with boredom, while townsmen leaned on the rails and studied them with hunger. Clara stood stiff in a faded dress, a widow's defiance in her dark eyes. The child's shawl she carried was clutched tight, as though by holding it she might hold her lost life together. Beside her was Isolde, younger, her wrist scarred, her braids hanging like shackles. She did not look at the crowd, only at the ground, as if even the sky had turned its back on her. Elias stepped forward, spoke his bid, and silence rippled. Some laughed outright, calling him soft-headed, a fool pouring his last coins into two mouths he could not feed. He did not answer them. His money changed hands, and in the hush that followed, the two women found themselves staring at the man who had just traded his future for their uncertain freedom. They followed him because there was nowhere else to go. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled out of town, leaving behind whispers sharp as knives. Across the prairie the horizon stretched endless, grass whispering under the weight of wind. The sky was vast enough to bury them all. No words passed among them, only the creak of wood, the shifting of shawl against shoulder, the hollow breath of the horses. When at last they reached his land, it rose out of the emptiness like an abandoned memory. A weathered house leaned into the wind, its porch boards warped and weary. Two rocking chairs swayed slightly though no one touched them. Above the hearth inside hung an old rifle, its steel dulled but still present, a sentinel of forgotten years. The women stood in the doorway, uncertain whether they had been freed or simply exchanged one cage for another. Elias said nothing, only set down his hat and walked past them, his steps slow but firm. He had rescued them, yes, but he did not know how to offer comfort. His heart carried too many graves, too many names etched in silence. So the house held its breath, filled with distance and the weight of lives forced together by circumstance. They were free, but not yet safe. And Elias Boone, older than the land itself, felt the burden of his choice settle heavy upon him, not as regret, but as a responsibility he could neither explain nor refuse. The days passed slow on Elias Boone's land, measured not by clocks but by the weight of work. The house breathed different now, the silence no longer empty but carrying the cautious footsteps of the two women who moved within its walls. Clara rose early, her movements brisk, though the lines in her face told of years too heavy for her shoulders. At night, when the air cooled, she pulled on a man's coat that dragged past her knees, her late husband's smell long faded but the memory clinging stubborn as burrs. In that coat she seemed both armored and undone, a widow wearing her grief like a second skin. Isolde spoke little. Her presence was a shadow by the fire, braiding her long dark hair with hands that worked slow and deliberate. The braids fell thick, heavy, and binding, like chains she refused to cut loose. Her scars told stories she would not, faint lines on her wrists from bindings that had once held her tighter than blood. The men who had owned her before Elias had taken her voice as well, leaving only silence where words should have been. Elias never asked questions. He set tools before them instead, fences needing mending, kindling to be split, beans to grind for coffee. In giving them work, he gave them steadiness, a return to dignity that charity could not provide. Yet even as their hands busied, their eyes carried ghosts. Clara often stared toward the mountain line, as if expecting a rider to return who never would. Isolde bent over her braids, her silence speaking more than stories could. A storm brewed one evening, wind gathering in the distance. Thunder rolled like drums of war, carrying memories none of them wished to name. Elias sat quiet on the porch, recalling the cartonwood tree where his wife lay, the soil forever damp with loss. Clara thought of her house seized and torn from her, the hearth where she once sang gone to ash. Isolde, in her silence, remembered nights where scream meant survival and silence meant surrender. The thunder drew closer. None spoke. In the hush before rain, they realized healing was not born from rescue alone, but from the dignity of being seen, of labor shared, of ghosts carried together in silence. Elias, watching the women from the threshold of his porch, understood at last that saving them was only the beginning. Rain began in a thin mist that darkened the dust, then swelled into sheets that bent the prairie grass and hammered the roof. Elias was at the barn when he saw the figure riding slow through the storm, a young drifter with a hat pulled low and eyes too sharp for a stranger's courtesy. He claimed to be selling horses, his voice slick as rainwater, and though Elias gave no welcome, Clara stepped forward with a small gesture of kindness. She poured coffee into a tin cup and set it before the man by the fire. Her hand trembled faintly as she did so, for it had been a long time since she had looked into a man's face without suspicion. Isolde did not share her trust. From the shadows she watched, her eyes never leaving the stranger's boots, the wet leather creaking as he shifted. When no one noticed, her fingers brushed the rifle above the hearth, testing its weight, her body tense as drawn wire. That night the storm tore loose its fury. Shutters rattled, wind screamed in the chimney. Amid the chaos, Clara stepped into the barn to steady the doors. She did not see the drifter follow until his hand caught her arm. His words came low and honeyed, promises laced with rot. Her heart kicked against her ribs, knowing the lie before it left his mouth. The barn door groaned open again, and Elias filled the frame, revolver steady, his face carved of stone. He did not speak. He did not need to. The drifter's grip loosened, his eyes flickering, and in the next breath he was gone, boots pounding through the mud, swallowed by the storm. When Clara returned to the cabin, drenched and shaking, Elias was already seated by the fire, his revolver put away, his gaze on the flames. He said nothing of what had passed, nor did he seek thanks. His presence was shield enough, as immovable as the cottonwoods bracing against the storm. Clara sat near him, the smallest flicker of safety warming through her weariness. Isolde, her hand still resting on the rifle, allowed herself, for the first time, to trust in silence not as submission, but as protection. The ranch settled into a rhythm of necessity. The fences needed mending, the barn roof leaked, the cattle strayed too often into the draws. Clara threw herself into the work with a fierceness that startled even Elias. She rose before dawn, carried buckets, drove posts until her palms split. Pride was the only thing keeping her upright, a pride that would rather see her hands bleed than accept the weight of being beholden to another. Elias watched, silent as always, his eyes tracing the trembling in her arms, the way she hid the blood on her apron. He said nothing. He had long learned that some battles of pride could not be taken from another soul. Isolde spoke little still, her silence as deep as the canyon shadows. Yet at times, when Elias bent over a broken harness, stitching leather with hands scarred and steady, she watched him with a quiet softening. She saw in those hands not the cruelty she had known, but a steadiness that did not ask, did not take. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. One evening, with firelight shifting across the cabin walls, Clara's voice broke the silence. Harsh, trembling, she turned on Elias. She accused him of buying them as if they were cattle at auction, her words trembling with all the years of shame and helplessness that had been forced upon her. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and Elias said nothing for a long while. When at last he spoke, his words were gravel, worn down by age and honesty. Yes, he said, I paid. But not to own you. I paid because no one else would, and I could not bear to watch you fall to ruin. His eyes did not waver from the fire. I expect nothing in return. The words, simple and stripped bare, cracked something inside Clara that anger could not hold together. Her breath shuddered. She looked away, not in shame, but in the aching relief of hearing truth without demand. Isolde stirred then, her voice low, almost lost in the hiss of the fire. She spoke a name, not the one the town had given her, but the one spoken to her as a child, in a language soft as wind through pines. Elias turned toward her, repeated it clumsily, the syllables heavy on his tongue but spoken with care. She laughed, quietly, for the first time since she had set foot in his house. It was not mockery, but the sound of something breaking free inside her chest. The fire burned low, shadows drawing longer, but the silence that settled afterward was no longer heavy with distance. It was different now, thinner, softer, carrying the faint sound of healing. Winter came down heavy, pressing its weight upon the prairie, sealing the land beneath ice and silence. The Boone cabin became their world, a place hemmed in by snowdrifts and firelight. Days were short, nights stretched long, and life gathered around the hearth where the flames cracked and the kettle hissed with coffee. Shawls hung from shoulders, and the smell of wood smoke clung to every thread of cloth. It was in these long nights that something gentler began to take root. Clara and Elias found themselves speaking more, not of the present but of the past, the stories each had carried too long in silence. She told of her husband, gone beneath iron wheels on the rails, of the cold cruelty of neighbors when debt came calling. Elias shared fragments of his youth, the river he once fished as a boy, the way his first horse had carried him through storms as though wings had been hidden in its legs. Their words did not banish grief, but in the laughter that sometimes broke through, small, reluctant, but real, they recognized in one another the weight of sorrow borne too long alone. Isolde changed too. Her silence broke not with words but with song. Low, mournful melodies in her own tongue, sung as she braided her long hair, filled the cabin. The sound was strange and holy, like wind slipping through canyon walls. Elias listened with his head bowed, and though he could not understand, tears welled without permission. But peace is fragile, and winter carried whispers. In town, tongues wagged. Men spoke of Elias Boone keeping 2 women under his roof, branding them harlots, mocking the old man's foolishness. One bitter afternoon they came, 3 riders at the gate, spitting insults sharp as knives. Elias stepped forward, steady but tired, ready to take their scorn in silence. Before he could, Clara strode past him, the rifle in her hands. She fired a warning shot into the frozen air, the crack splitting the stillness. The men flinched, cursed, and turned back toward town, their laughter breaking against the hard line of her defiance. Elias stood in the doorway, watching her shoulders steady, her eyes bright with fire not seen since widowhood hollowed her. He understood then, strength could be born again, even in broken souls. Isolde's songs, Clara's rifle, his own quiet endurance, together they had built a fortress not of walls, but of dignity reclaimed. The women were no longer captives of fate. They were fire itself, carrying warmth against the dark. And Elias Boone, once alone, found himself not protector of 2 lost women, but sheltered by them in return. Spring came soft, carrying the smell of thawed earth and wet grass, but with it road reckoning. The drifter returned, no longer alone. He brought others with him, men hungry for cruelty, men who laughed at the thought of taking back what Elias had stolen. They came with pistols on their hips and venom in their mouths, circling the Boone ranch like wolves testing a fire. Elias stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He was weary, his beard silvered, but he did not flinch. Clara stood at his side, rifle braced against her shoulder, her eyes alight with a widow's fire no grief could smother. Isolde stood close too, her hand steady as she slipped cartridges into waiting hands, her silence no longer born of fear but of resolve. The standoff cracked the air like lightning. Words were spat, curses thrown, and then came the sharp report of Clara's rifle. It split the morning wide. Isolde's hands moved calm and sure, feeding her strength into the fight. Elias lifted his revolver only once, the shot echoing clean across the fields. That was enough. Dust rose as the intruders scattered, their courage blown apart like chaff in the wind. When the stillness returned, heavier than gunpowder, something inside the house shifted. Clara slipped off her late husband's coat and hung it by the door, her shoulders no longer needing its weight. Isolde unbraided her hair, the dark strands falling free into the spring light. Elias sat down in the rocking chair, for the first time not as a man haunted, but as one at rest. Later they rode into town together. Whispers trailed after them, sharp as knives but dulled by fear. None dared speak against them. The women did not walk behind Elias, but beside him, their steps matched, their silence strong. What began as purchase had become something unspoken, something sacred. Redemption had taken shape not in vows but in firelight, in danger shared, in the refusal to abandon. They rode home as equals, bound not by need, but by chosen love and the dignity of survival.